Mike Snell here again with the Captain Phoenix channel. So today we're going to go over a very specific topic and offer a very specific economics lesson about supply versus demand and what is and shortages versus artificial shortages. So this lesson is hyper specific. So hopefully this video is going to be kind of short because I should be able to do this lesson in very short order just because of its hyper specificity. So some points came up online recently in discussions I've had online about, with coronavirus being the topic of the moment and the topic of the day, some of the flaws in the U.S.'s governmental level response to the coronavirus outbreak here in the United States and abroad. And one of the things that came up was this notion of forced scarcity. So the idea is that one of the problems that has come up that's been a flaw, let's say, of the governmental response system. It's just the idea. I'm not necessarily making the argument that this is the case, but in the early stages of the coronavirus's outbreak here in the United States, there weren't enough test kits to test all of the people that should probably be tested for coronavirus. And that, folks, is a shortage. So the thing that you need to know about shortages is, well, what is a shortage? A shortage is just simply a situation in which the supply that exists does not meet the demand. I don't know if I can do my supply curves versus your demand curves in mirrored fashion, so I'm not going to be able to draw it out for you. But the idea with a shortage is that it could be temporary, it could be permanent, it could be a fixture of some sort of level of interference, which I've gone into in previous videos. I will link to those videos in this video's description. An artificial shortage is a situation in which the supply actually does meet the demand. However, the supplier of the good is withholding the good from the market. So what De Beers did years ago was, it wasn't that they were deliberately limiting their capacity to mine diamonds. And it wasn't that they were necessarily just saying, we have the capacity to mine more diamonds, so we're not going to mine as many diamonds. No, because the diamonds need to actually be brought to fruition. They need to become actual sellable commodities. They can't be, diamonds in the ground are not commodities. They have to be mined. You have to mix your labor with the soil. So when that per carat price dropped, what they would do is just simply stockpile diamonds so that the price would then go up. This is what's called an artificial shortage. So in this case, there isn't an actual shortage, as in there isn't less supply than there is demand. Less supply than there is demand. It's a situation in which there is the supply to meet the demand, but the supply isn't coming to market. Now, I would argue, in the case of the coronavirus testing kits, a huge part of why those testing kits weren't coming to market, and we'll get into the real reason they weren't coming to market, was because of governmental regulations on the private sector that was precluding the type of testing necessary to prove that these testing kits will actually work. First things first, what we're talking about is artificial shortages or artificial scarcity. They're synonymous terms. When I was in economics in college, it was called artificial shortages where I was taught. I think that there's been a transition towards artificial scarcity. There is no such thing as forced scarcity. So no matter how many times you see YouTubers claim that there is such a thing as forced scarcity, I think what they're talking about is artificial shortages or scarcity. Just because somebody uses literally to mean figuratively doesn't mean the word literally means figuratively. Just because somebody misuses a word doesn't mean that word now takes on that new definition. In fact, it does the exact opposite. It retains the old definition, and that's just a misuse of the word. The real reason that there exists a shortage, and from what our discussion was from the way our discussion was going, was that the testing kits specific to this strand of coronavirus, the COVID-19, didn't exist. So the technology didn't exist. So what that means is that there can't be a shortage. This is just a non-existent technology. So the difference between a shortage and a non-existent technology is that because the non-existent technology is non-existent, because the technology doesn't exist, you can't build a metric for demand for it. And this actually leads us to the main topic I want to talk about here, which is that supply begets demand, not the other way around. The perfect example is of supply begetting demand and not the other way around is Vaseline. And before we get into that, supply begetting demand is the whole principle behind supply side economics. There's a misnomer that supply side economics is trickle down. No, trickle down theory doesn't exist. We've talked about that in other channels, which I will link to in this video's description as well. But John Maynard Keynes' The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money was the first place where this notion was posited that the demand begets supply. He's actually been proved quite wrong, as the examples of the 20th century have shown. I've done a review of this book in my other channel. Again, I'll link to that video in this video's description as well, so go ahead and check that out. But Vaseline was invented in the late 1800s, and it really wasn't even invented. Vaseline is a byproduct, a waste byproduct of the refinement process from crude oil to kerosene. Back in the late 1800s, when we were using kerosene as lamp oil to bring light into the home. Okay, so the product existed. Nobody wanted it because there was no use for it. So what was the demand before the product existed? Zero. In fact, for all of the good that it was able to provide and provides to this day, none of that's realizable. And what does that mean? That means that when it first existed as a waste byproduct of the refinement process of bringing crude oil from its crude state to the refined state, which is kerosene, it existed. We all knew it existed. It had to be thrown out by the bucket load. So that was an indicator that the thing didn't exist. The use of it didn't exist. So how could there possibly be any demand for it? In that case, the demand wasn't even NA, it was zero. And when it was first brought to market as a marketable product, as an actual commodity rather than just a waste byproduct, it was marketed as having all of these wonderful medical effects, all of these wonderful uses in medicine, which are absolutely true. So yeah, I mean, if you've got an open wound and you need to clean it up and dress it, one of the things you can do to help it heal more quickly is apply some Vaseline. There's other uses for it as lubrication that were discovered much later. But if I were to get my DeLorean and go back into 1820 and say, I've got this wonderful product and here's all of the things that it can do for you. If I could describe that product to you, I've got product X. And they would say, yeah, I'd love to have some of that product. So you're going to argue to me then that the demand has created the supply. No, because the product I could be describing to you is bacitracin. So we don't necessarily have demand for Vaseline. We might have this ethereal demand for something that does all of these things, but that's not necessarily Vaseline. It could be bacitracin. And to that effect, too, there's no way to develop a demand curve for something that is completely in the ether. So for example, all human beings need to eat. So there's no way to develop a demand curve for food, right? So we all need food. So you could argue that there is demand for food, but that's not really even the case because there's no way to build that, right? There is demand for paint. Well, we need to be more specific about that. Do you mean oil-based paint? Do you mean latex-based paint? Do you mean interior house paint? Do you mean exterior house paint? So in January, what's the demand for exterior house paint? It's probably terrible, isn't it? What's the demand for interior house paint? Well, it's probably not that much different from the demand for interior house paint in the summer. The same thing with house paint and exterior and interior house paint in the summer. Well, it's probably going to spike in places like North New England. The exterior house paint demand is probably going to spike in the summer months when the only time of the year when you have to actually paint the exterior of houses. So you got to hurry up and get them turned around. So there's going to be a trend, that's going to look like this throughout the course of the year, whereas the trend's going to be kind of flat for the level of demand for interior house paint. It's going to be relatively flat, which is why you can't build a demand curve for paint. Right? Because what do you mean paint? So if anyone ever brings that up, that demand begets supply, you now have the tools to disprove that. And Vaseline is the tool you should be using. So moving forward, hopefully that helps people out there. I hope you've all enjoyed. Happy to keep continuing doing these little videos. Hopefully this isn't going to be too ridiculously long. It's getting kind of long. But anyways, till then, this has been Mike. Signing off.